Morning light came through the kitchen window the way it always does in November, thin and pale, like it's apologizing for something. I was sitting at the table with my coffee going cold beside me. I do that a lot now. Make coffee, forget about it, make another cup. My neighbor June teases me about it, says I'm single-handedly keeping the coffee industry afloat by not drinking any of it. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular that morning, just watching the bare oak tree in the backyard. My husband Raymond planted that tree 26 years ago, the spring after we bought the house. He said it would give us shade in our old age. He was right about the tree. He didn't make it to the old age part. That was 9 years ago. You'd think by now I'd have stopped reaching to his side of the bed in the morning. I haven't. My name is Margaret. I'm 68 years old. I taught third grade at Pinecrest Elementary for 31 years, and I can still name every single child who ever sat in my classroom. That's the kind of memory I have. I remember birthdays. I remember who liked the window seat. I remember which kids came to school without a proper lunch and needed a little extra from my desk drawer. I remember everything. Except, for a long time, I forgot to remember myself. My daughter Cecily was born in 1989. She came into the world at 3014 in the morning during a thunderstorm that knocked out half the power on our street. Raymond drove 30 miles an hour the whole way to the hospital because he was terrified of the wet roads. I told him later that if I'd had to wait any longer in that car, I would have had the baby right there in the parking lot of a Sunoco station. She was beautiful. Dark hair, Raymond's eyes, my stubbornness. We found that out quickly enough. She was a serious child, always reading, always organizing things into neat little piles. She corrected her teacher sometimes, which made parent-teacher conferences interesting. By 14, she was talking about college. By 17, she had a list of schools ranked by graduation rates and starting salaries. I was proud. Of course I was proud. You raise a child who knows what she wants and you feel like you've done something right. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, is that sometimes children grow into people who are very good at wanting things from you without knowing how to give anything back. I don't say that lightly. I've turned it over in my mind for years, looking for the place where I went wrong, the moment I should have done something different. I still can't find it. Cecily met Nathan her junior year at Ohio State. He was in her economics program, came from a family in Connecticut, the kind of family where the parents had a different last name for the beach house. He was polished in a way that made me a little nervous, the kind of polish that comes from never having to worry about anything. But he treated her well as far as I could see, and she was happy. So I smiled and passed the dinner rolls and asked him about his internship. They graduated in 2011 into a rough job market, and I helped. That's what mothers do. I helped with first and last month's rent on their apartment in Columbus. I helped when Nathan's car needed a new transmission. I drove 4 hours to babysit when Cecily had her work conference in Phoenix because they didn't want to spend money on a sitter. I sent birthday money, Christmas money, just because money. I helped when they had a gap between paychecks. I helped when they wanted to go to Cancun and were a little short. I taught third grade. I was not a wealthy woman, but Raymond had left me the house and a modest life insurance policy, and I was careful with it. I always thought, I always thought it would matter someday that I'd been careful. After Raymond died, I was alone in a house with 4 bedrooms and 31 years of lesson plans in the garage. I kept teaching because teaching was the only place where I still felt like myself. 8-year-olds don't care if you're grieving. They just want to know if it's time for recess. There's something very clarifying about that. I retired at 65. Cecily and Nathan came for the small party my colleagues threw in the school library. They stayed for 2 hours and left before cake because Nathan had an early meeting. I ate my piece of cake alone in the passenger seat of my car and then drove home. That was the year they started talking about the wedding. Cecily and Nathan had been together for 9 years at that point, living together for 7. I had stopped asking about marriage around year 4 because every time I mentioned it, Cecily would get a tight look around her eyes like I was nagging. So I stopped. And then suddenly there was a ring, a very large ring, I noticed, and a date 14 months out, and a venue in Nantucket that I looked up later and nearly knocked my tea off the counter. I said nothing about the cost. It wasn't my business. They were adults. They had good jobs by then. Nathan had moved into financial consulting. Cecily was managing a regional team for a pharmaceutical company. They had done well for themselves. I was glad. I said yes immediately when Cecily asked if I could contribute to the wedding fund. Of course. $12,000, which was a significant piece of what Raymond had left me, but she was my daughter and it was her wedding. I wrote the check without hesitating. What I did not expect was what came 3 weeks later. I was on the phone with Cecily. She was telling me about the florist they'd chosen, peonies, the centerpieces, all of it. And somewhere in the middle of it, she went quiet for a moment and then said, in the voice she uses when she's already decided something and is just informing me, "Mom, I need to talk to you about the rehearsal dinner." "Of course," I said. "What do you need?" "It's just, the rehearsal dinner is going to be at the Wharf House. It's the nicest place on the island, and Nathan's family is hosting it, and their guest list is pretty specific." I waited. "We have a really limited number of seats," she said. "And Nathan's family already has so many people coming from Connecticut, and we need to make sure the table works out. And, Cecily," I said, "am I not invited to my daughter's rehearsal dinner?" There was a pause that lasted exactly long enough for me to understand the answer. "It's not personal, Mom. It's just numbers." I sat very still on my end of the phone. I was in the living room. The oak tree was visible through the back sliding door. I looked at it. "I see," I said. "You understand, right? It's just logistics." I told her I understood. I said it because I didn't know what else to say yet. And then we talked about peonies for another few minutes, and I got off the phone and I sat there until it got dark. My friend Roberta called me that evening. She has a sense about these things. She always has. And I told her what happened. Roberta is 72 and has been through her own version of this with her son, so she didn't try to explain it away or tell me I'd misunderstood. She just said, "What are you going to do?" I didn't know yet. What I knew was this. I had $12,000 of my retirement sitting in their wedding account. I had bought a dress in July, sage green, that I'd thought was simple and elegant. I had been looking forward to seeing Cecily walk down an aisle, and now I was being told there wasn't room for me at a dinner table the night before. I kept trying to find a version of it that made sense. Maybe it really was just numbers. Maybe Nathan's family had an unusually large extended family and there genuinely wasn't room. Maybe Cecily hadn't realized how it would sound. But then I remembered the look on her face at my retirement party, when someone asked if she'd learned everything she knew from her mother. She had laughed and said, "Not everything," and moved on quickly. And I remembered Thanksgiving 2 years ago when I'd made the same sweet potato casserole I'd made every year since she was 7. And she'd said, in front of Nathan's mother, "Mom still makes everything from scratch, even when it's easier not to." Said it like it was something quaint, like I was something quaint. Small things, each one small. But I'd been collecting them for years without quite admitting what I was collecting. I slept poorly for 3 nights. On the fourth morning, I called Roberta again and I said, "I've decided I'm going to the wedding, just not the rehearsal dinner, since I'm not invited." "But I'm going to the wedding." "Of course you are," she said. "She's your daughter." "I'm going to sit wherever I'm placed," I said. "I'm going to be polite. I'm going to watch her get married. And then I'm going to go home." "And the money?" Roberta asked. I hadn't decided about the money yet. The wedding was on a Saturday in late September. I drove to the Cape on Friday alone and stayed at a small inn about 2 miles from the venue, a place I'd found on my own, paid for myself, that had a window overlooking a salt marsh. I ate dinner alone at a restaurant nearby, a chowder that was very good, and I went to bed early. I thought about Raymond. I thought about how he would have handled this. He was not a man who stayed quiet when someone hurt the people he loved, but he also wasn't a man who made scenes. He would have found some elegant middle ground that I've never quite managed. I wore the sage green dress. I had my hair done at a salon down the street from the inn. a woman named Patricia who had fingers like a pianist and told me I had beautiful bone structure, which I appreciated more than I would have admitted. The venue was everything I had expected. White tent, water views, flowers everywhere, peonies exactly as promised. Nathan's family occupied a long section near the front, his mother in a cream suit, his father, aunts, and cousins, a whole contingent of Connecticut. Cecily's side was smaller. A young usher walked me to a seat, in the back row. I recognized it for what it was. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe Cecily hadn't coordinated the seating. Maybe the usher had simply misread a chart. I told myself these things and then I folded them up neatly and set them aside because it didn't actually matter. What mattered was that I was there. I watched my daughter walk down the aisle on the arm of her uncle, Raymond's brother, who had offered when Cecily said she didn't want me to do it because it would be weird. Raymond's brother had told me this on the phone, gently, not knowing what to say. I had told him it was fine. I had said, just take care of her. And he had. She looked beautiful. Whatever has happened between us, she looked beautiful. And I felt the full complicated weight of loving someone you made, someone who came from your body and your life, and every sacrifice you ever didn't mention. And I let myself feel it completely right there in the back row, in the sage green dress with no one on either side of me. I did not cry during the ceremony. I am a woman who has cried privately for 9 years over a man I miss every day, so I have learned something about where to put grief, so it doesn't spill. At the reception, I found my name card at a table near the exit. I was seated next to a man named Gerald, Nathan's great-uncle, recently widowed. A little hard of hearing, and a couple I'd never met who were colleagues of Nathan's from work. They were perfectly pleasant. We talked about the weather, the view, the food, which was excellent. Cecily came to the table once, briefly, to say hello. She was luminous in the way that brides are. She squeezed my hand. She said, "I'm so glad you could make it, Mom." Like I was a distant cousin who had made a long trip. Like I had not written a check for $12,000 4 months ago. Like I had not driven 4 hours alone and eaten chowder by myself the night before so I could be here in the back of her wedding to watch her begin her life. "You look beautiful," I said, and I meant it. She moved on to the next table. I stayed for the dinner and the first dance. I did not stay for the cake cutting. I said goodbye to Gerald, who had been good company in the way that lonely people sometimes are with each other. And I walked back across the gravel path to my rental car, and I sat there for a moment in the dark. The salt marsh was somewhere out in that direction. I couldn't see it, but I could smell it. That particular smell of tidal water and grass that I have loved since I was a girl. I drove back to the inn and I sat in the window and I watched the moonlight on the water and I thought for a long time about the rest of my life. Here is what I had: a house that was paid off, a modest retirement from teaching, Raymond's life insurance, minus what I'd contributed to a wedding where I ate dinner next to a man I'd never met and wasn't introduced from the stage with the other parents. My health, which is good, a best friend in Roberta who answers the phone on the fourth ring every time, a neighbor in June who leaves tomatoes on my porch in August, a whole life behind me and, if I'm lucky, a reasonable stretch of it still ahead. Here is what I decided. Sitting in that window, I was done arranging myself around people who had stopped seeing me. I drove home on Sunday. On Monday morning, I called my attorney, a woman named Susan who handled Raymond's estate and who I trust completely, and I told her I wanted to update my will. This was not a decision made in anger. I want to be clear about that. I had been thinking about it for longer than I admitted to myself. The rehearsal dinner had not caused it. It had only made it impossible to keep pretending. I left the house to a land trust that will keep it from being developed. I had always liked the idea of that yard and those oak trees outlasting all of us. I left a portion to Cecily. She is still my daughter, and I am not a cruel woman, but not the majority. The majority I split between the local library's endowment, which Raymond had always supported, and a scholarship fund at Pinecrest Elementary for kids who need school supplies and don't have them. I know exactly which kids those are. I've been looking in their backpacks for 31 years. Susan asked me if I was sure. I said yes. She asked me if I wanted to think about it a little longer. I said I'd been thinking about it for months. She drew up the papers and I signed them on a Wednesday afternoon, and then I went and had lunch at the diner on Route 9, where Roberta and I meet every week, and I had the grilled cheese, which I never let myself order, and it was very good. Roberta was already in the booth when I got there. She looked at my face and she said, "You did it." "I did." She nodded. She didn't say anything else for a moment. Then she said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it. The oak tree Raymond planted, the chowder on Friday night, the sage green dress, the back row, the salt marsh in the dark. "Light?" I said. "I feel lighter than I have in a long time." She picked up the menu even though we both know it by heart. "Then let's have pie," she said. "You've earned it." I laughed. "A real one. The kind that comes from somewhere deep and unguarded." And I ordered the pie. I still think about Cecily. I think about the little girl who corrected her teachers and organized her crayons by color and used to climb into bed with us during thunderstorms when she thought we were asleep. I love her. I will love her until I am no longer capable of anything at all. But love is not the same thing as endless availability. Love is not the same as accepting that you are less important than a seating chart. Love is not the same as pretending you do not see what you see. I am 68 years old. I have a good doctor, a comfortable house, a friend who orders pie with me on Wednesdays, and a backyard with an oak tree that is finally giving decent shade. Raymond was right about that tree. He was right about most things. I am not waiting for an apology. I am not waiting for an apology. I am not waiting for anything. I got up this morning and my coffee went cold before I drank it, and the light came thin and pale through the kitchen window. And I sat there and I looked at the tree and I felt for the first time in a long time like the story I was living in was finally my own. I've had a lot of time to think about how we get to the places we end up, not in a dramatic way, just the quiet kind of thinking that happens when you're sitting at a kitchen table watching light move across the floor, the kind where you trace things back, not to assign blame, not to punish anyone in your mind, but just to understand. I gave Cecily everything I had, not because I was naive and not because I didn't know how to say no. I gave because I believed, the way most mothers believe, that love and sacrifice were the same thing. That if I showed up enough, helped enough, stayed quiet enough when it would have been easier to speak, it would all come back around. What I've learned, and I don't say this with any bitterness left in it, is that what we give without boundaries doesn't always teach the people we love to value us. Sometimes it teaches them the opposite, not because they're bad people, but because we trained them, slowly and without meaning to expect us to absorb whatever they needed without complaint. Every check I wrote without hesitation, every 4-hour drive I made without being asked how I was doing, every time I said of course when I should have said let's talk about this, those were lessons too. Just not the ones I meant to give. The rehearsal dinner was not the beginning. The back row at the wedding was not the beginning. The beginning was years earlier. Every time I told myself that keeping the peace was the same as keeping the relationship. It isn't. I know that now. What strikes me, looking back, is that the moment I finally made a decision for myself, sitting in that window at the inn, looking out at the salt marsh, signing those papers with Susan on a Wednesday, I felt more like myself than I had in years. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. Because the self I'd been setting aside for 2 decades to make room for everyone else was still there. She'd just been waiting quietly, the way I'd taught her to wait. I think about what Raymond would say. He was not a complicated man in the best possible way. He would probably say that people show you who they are if you're willing to look, and that looking isn't the same as giving up on them. You can love someone and still decide what you will and will not accept. Those two things can live in the same heart at the same time. Cecily is still my daughter. That doesn't change. But I am also still myself, a woman who taught children for 31 years to be honest, to be kind, to do the right thing even when it costs you something. I owe it to every child who ever sat in my classroom to actually live by that, not just teach it. There is a kind of quiet strength that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't make speeches. It doesn't wait for applause from the back row. It just gets up in the morning, lets the coffee go cold, looks at the oak tree, and decides again and again and again that its own life is worth living on its own terms. That's all I'm doing. That's what I hope you take from this, if you take anything at all.